Welcome to the latest episode of our podcast, Neil Lazarus Talks Israel. Today, we cut through the media spin and tackle one of the biggest challenges in reporting on the Middle East: manipulation. Neil's guest is Adam Levick from the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, better known as CAMRA. CAMRA is a nonprofit organization dedicated to holding journalists accountable for inaccurate reporting. In this podcast, Neil and Adam dive into how Hamas plays the victim card, why Israel struggles to be seen as one, and the shocking double standards in reporting of many journalists. They also discuss the importance of accuracy in media narratives. Get ready for a conversation that challenges perspectives and exposes the truth. Let's get started. Neil, over to you.
So we're joined today by Adam Levick from CAMRA, a non-profit organization which monitors and tries to counter media bias. Adam, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Great to be on your show, Neil.
So first of all, let me ask you, how did CAMRA start, and what's its origins and what's its major function?
Its origins started in 1982 and around the first Lebanon War. And that's because it was around that time that those who were involved in the origins of the organization found that the Western media coverage of Israel had really begun to deteriorate with the coverage of that war, and that there needed to be a grassroots organization to try to fight back, to try to promote accuracy in media reporting. So around that time, CAMRA was founded with a mission that, though we've expanded since then over the past 43 years, the mission has remained the same. That is to promote accurate reporting about Israel in the media.
Okay, if I can interject there, when you say accurate, yeah. Okay, so the issue of bias, right? Can you define what bias is? Because look, I can read something and say, hey, I disagree with that, that's wrong. And the opposite. Whenever I give a seminar, I always say to people, you should watch CNN, you should watch Fox, and understand opinions that disagree with you. So what's the difference between something being biased in the media and just like, hey, that sucks, I disagree with it?
No, that's a great question. We get that question all the time. Basically, when the word I used was accuracy. So, accuracy, we operate under the belief that there are such things as facts, right? It's not just a matter of perspective. And that with rigorous research, whether you're a reporter or whether you're working for CAMRA, there are facts that are discernible, right? So when we contact journalists and or editors in an attempt to get a correction, we focus almost primarily on factual errors, things that you can quantify as true or false. Now, the word bias, again, that means different things to different people, but bias might be, say, a sin of omission, right? So, for instance, if during the recent release of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails, if a article mentioned the release of this prisoner and didn't mention, for instance, like the prisoner's crimes, the reason why they were jailed in the first place, and oftentimes it was murder or some act of terrorism, that's an omission that translates into a factual error, right? So again, media outlets are free to editorialize, they're free to comment, they're free to write opinion pieces, and they're free to even craft a story to their own liking. But what they're not able to do, and what their own standards, whether it be in the UK or the US, require them, is to have a rigorous fealty towards the truth. So, we're in the fact business, not the, pro-Israel business. We make no secret of the fact that we're pro-Israel, but we're not requiring that, we're not demanding that media outlets toe the Israeli line, just that they toe the factual line.
Aren't you missing the boat? Because the reality is the real battle is not traditional media anymore, it's social media. What's CAMRA doing to counter the pure fake news or bias, for want of a better word, or inaccuracy, which is on social media, which means that any person, anyone who has followers can influence?
Yeah, we tend to stay away from pure social media kind of, meaning we have a very active social media presence on X, on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and YouTube. I might be forgetting one. And we certainly may engage depending on who the person is. If there's a say an influencer, an anti-Israel influencer who is promoting a falsehood that's getting traction, but generally we stay in our lane, and by that I mean, we focus on the journalists, people working in the media who are promoting lies.
Again, isn't that someone could be very critical there, because you could say that's you're driving down the slow lane, because even your journalist of today, 2025, is having to adapt to the demands and competition, literally, of social media. If I give a seminar and to the 20 to 30 age group, and I ask them to put up their hands and say, how do you get your information? At least 60% are saying through my social media stream. You get younger than that, the university students, vast majority are not watching the full episode of CNN or reading the New York Times. So what would you say to a critic who's saying you're in the wrong lane?
Well, I would say two things. Number one, I've seen those surveys, and the one I think deceptive framing of those surveys is when they refer to content on social media, be it X or Facebook, oftentimes what they're referring to is articles that are posted on those media sites, right? So it isn't just, generic X or Facebook user promoting false information. It's usually linking to an article, right? So to the degree that article that article is from a mainstream Western outlet, which is what we cover, then by tackling the article at the source, the social media posting of that article will be, in a better place. So in other words, like, social media is huge, and I agree with you. But again, I think mostly what people are posting is content from traditional media or even from people's Substack, right? So we're completely aware of the reliance that most news consumers have on social media, but I think it's often driven by legacy media outlets, by journalists themselves. Again, journalists themselves often publish posts on social media before they even send it through their editor gatekeeper. So I still think at the core of misinformation and the core of the most influential medium is the legacy media outlets. And also, just social media is too huge. So, we have to pick our battles, right? We have to stay in our lane.
I understand. Yeah. Look, let's pick up on your comments about journalists. Especially, I think this war is unique because we've really seen Hamas being very successful in setting the agenda. Whether it's over aid going, so-called humanitarian aid going into Gaza, even having their own journalists on site prior to October the 7th, etc. Could you give us a very short synopsis of how does Hamas manipulate Joe Schmo, the average journalist who's just been appointed to cover the Middle East conflict?
Well, let me answer that by going by stepping back a little bit. They're only able to manipulate journalists to the degree that journalists are willing to be manipulated. I mean, it takes two to tango, right? It isn't as if Hamas are PR geniuses. I mean, they kind of understand the West in a way that helps them, right? They understand that in the West, the greatest thing you can be is a victim, and they're good at playing the victim card. However, ultimately, we believe that journalists have agency, right? People have agency. And so ultimately, there are journalists that are falling and are susceptible to this terrorist propaganda because kind of it feeds an internal narrative that they want to promote to their readers, right? So it's a two-way street. However, I would argue that even though it's up to journalists to kind of see through that, I think Hamas, and particularly Sinwar, kind of understood that to the degree that the October 7th attack was going to be successful, that it would involve playing the media in a way that put international pressure on Israel to not go full in, to pull back, and to eventually agree to a ceasefire. So look, on one hand, I agree that Hamas plays the victim card very well. They also feed into these kind of post-colonial narratives of this binary victim and oppressor narrative that the media has been already playing for decades. But I still think the fault lies with people that are buying the narrative promoted by a anti-Semitic extremist group, which perpetrated the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Holocaust. So, and I also, the corollary of that is people always ask why Israeli Hezbollah is so bad. And I think they're asking the wrong question. Like, I don't know that even the best Israeli public relations would be able to fight back these cultural and ideological trends that have been percolating in the West within academia and within the within journalism that sees everything through a binary oppressor and oppressed. So
but I also disagree, because I think that
okay.
I think inherently within Zionist ideology, and especially towards the right of Israel, there's a refusal to play the victim card. So one, they refuse, that doesn't sell well in the West. As you said, the Western audiences like to see victims, and we refuse to play that card. Second of all, I think also is it's happened for so long that the West can't see Israel as victims. That the coverage, if you like, of October the 7th massacre died out very, very quickly. What would you say is, or how would you characterize the coverage of October the 7th onwards? If there were three main pillars of inaccuracy, what would they be?
Well, one of them is, October 7th massacre inversion, which, and we've documented this at thecamera.org in my, I'm the co-editor of Camera UK. I wrote a post in, I believe, October 24th. And it was based on my conclusion of reading 3 weeks by then, or maybe not quite 3 weeks of coverage of The Guardian and Sky and a couple other outlets. And the narrative almost immediately, from maybe after the first few days after the massacre, began to change to not one about the grotesque massacre and rape and mutilation and torture of 1,200 Israelis, men, women, and children, but about Israel's quote unquote disproportional response. In fact, you'd find even as early as 2 or 3 days after the massacre, influential people on social media describing Israel's response as a ethnic cleansing or even a genocide. And in fact, within 2 weeks in October, from I believe the 11th to the 24th at The Guardian, there were 11 pieces in 13 days that in some way promoted the argument that what Israel was engaged in response to October 7th was an ethnic cleansing or a genocide to be. So, there is that October 7th inversion for one thing. And secondly, there was this unbelievable credulity in the face of Hamas claims about death counts and the percentage of civilians amongst the dead. We're talking about, I think it's truly extraordinary, and you can't make this point strongly enough, that within days or weeks after the atrocity, people were trusting the statistics from Hamas-run ministries, right after, the group carried out the atrocities. So there's that just credulity or wanting to believe that even in the face of this terrorist group and this terrorist onslaught, that you can trust the information coming from Hamas, and at the same time, a incredulity in the face of Israeli claims, this like almost instinctual need to find fault or to undercut Israeli claims coming from government sources, which are again from a democratic country that is accountable.
Right. So the Israel is producing propaganda, but we can believe the Hamas.
Yeah, and you find this also to this day with media outlets relying on Gaza stringers and Gaza journalists for information about what's going on, and they justify it by saying that it's really hard for a Western journalist to get into Gaza unless you're on an IDF tour. But they never mention when they cite, or very rarely do Western media outlets cite the fact that these Gaza journalists are living under Hamas, and so aren't free, obviously, to report or send reports to Western outlets that are critical of Hamas, or information about the tunnels, or information about the abuse of Israeli hostages.
Is there a difference between American and British coverage?
I don't cover the American media. We have colleagues like that, but I would say overall, if you're looking at, say, the major media outlets in the UK, so I mean the most, say the Guardian, the Independent, the Guardian, BBC, Sky News. I don't think there is that much difference between how the New York Times, the Washington Post, or CNN covers it. And again, I'm saying this from someone who doesn't cover the American media with the same level of scrutiny that I cover the British media. So no, I don't think. I think that if you had one of my colleagues who covers the New York Times or CNN or the Washington Post, I think, and I know this from meetings we have with staff, we confer with each other. I think the coverage has been really, really appalling, on both sides of the pond.
Is it anti-Semitism?
Look, I'm very careful to accuse people of anti-Semitism. I have throughout my entire career. I'm doing this for 15 years, unless there's evidence. So, for instance, our Arabic department has been successful at finding Arabic journalists that work for, say, BBC Arabic or other Western Arabic stations that have praised Hitler, right? or engaged in some other anti-Semitic trope. So, but in lieu of evidence that a particular journalist is anti-Semitic or is motivated by anti-Semitism, no, that's not a word that I use that much. Again, unless there's something in an article or an op-ed that evokes classic anti-Semitic tropes. I think.
Hold on, aren't you referring to a classic form of anti-Semitism, which is based more on the right? The left's anti-Semitism, I think, is more complicated, and what we are seeing is, look, you can be anti-Semitic without being an anti-Semite. In other words, you can write something which is totally fascinated by Israel, but not write something about massacres in Syria. That double standard, I would say, is anti-Semitic. It's not just praising Hitler. So is your definition of what is anti-Semitism too narrow?
Well, I mean, look, we spend a lot of time talking about anti-Semitism internally, but we generally like to use the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition, when we're making accusations of anti-Semitism. However, I completely agree that insofar as, and again, this is consistent with IRA, right? IRA says that double standards, when Israel is held to a standard that no other country is held to, that can be defined as anti-Semitic. So I think what you just said is completely consistent with the accepted international definition of anti-Semitism. What I'm saying is, I think some people on social media, some friendly activists, pro-Israel activists, use the term a little bit too much. And we tried to be a little more careful because, we think that, false accusations of anti-Semitism hurt our cause. And, we're more focused on promoting the truth and calling people out on things they say about Israel and the war between Israel and Hamas that aren't true. But don't get me wrong, I think there might be an underbelly of anti-Semitism within a lot of the coverage. It takes a lot more unpacking, and it takes a lot more context, and it takes a lot more attention to the subtext. So to the degree that we're going to make an argument that something is anti-Semitic or is redolent of anti-Semitism, we would generally be very careful in unpacking that within a long blog post, as opposed to just making a categorical, lazy accusation on Twitter. All I'm saying is we're very careful with that term, because we think that word has power, it means something, and we think that our cause is harm when people use that too flippantly.
But isn't Israel, some of the claims which they make may be accurate? Isn't Israel engaged in some form of forced starvation? In other words, putting pressure on Hamas by cutting electricity, cutting water supplies, cutting food. Isn't that criticism legitimate?
Yeah, as long as it's based on accurate reporting. For instance, A lot of the reporting since Israel made the decision has ignored the fact that Gaza has stockpiles of fuel, that a lot of Gazans rely on generators and solar panels, and that Israel's only responsible for 50% of the electricity that goes into Gaza anyway. So, look, we're not here to defend Israel. We're not a Hasbara organization, but the degree that the reporting about the Israel's decision to cut supplies off to Gaza, as long as it's accurate, that's fair opinion. But I think very often you'll find, especially if you go back and look at the stories written about claims that there was mass starvation in Gaza that ended up certainly not being true, that those were based on faulty reports, on poor methodology within the reports, on surveys that only counted part of the aid entering Gaza. So again, we go through articles about Israel's actions with a fine-tooth comb, and we post and complain if it's inaccurate. In terms of the broader, in terms of how Israel looks, that's certainly not on our agenda. We're concerned about what facts are being promoted and whether those facts are accurate.
But give us some tips if people, are listening to this podcast and they see something which they think is inaccurate, etc. What should they do?
You should contact us.
How do they contact you? What are your contacts?
There's lots of ways. If you go to the camera.org.uk uk.org website, at the top right, there's a contact us form. There's also at the main camera site a contact us form. It's very easy to find if you go to the home page. And we really rely heavily on tips by people that read our material. So you can go that way, or you can tweet us. If you're you should post on X and tag us, and we'll see that. You can also message us on Facebook. You can email us. Basically, if you go to the About Us page on either camera.org or camera-uk.org, you'll see how you can contact us. So the first thing, if you flag it, is to contact us. And we appreciate that. We use tips sometimes to promote corrections. So if you're a social media guy, do it on social media. If you want to go to our website, you can contact us very easily, again, through an online form. And we really, really like when we receive that.
Great. Thanks very much for joining us. And hopefully one day you'll be unemployed. The world will be a greater place. And we won't need to have organizations like yourself. But clearly, the work you're doing is essential work. And thank you for what you do.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.